Hello, my name is Dr. Nita Shattuck. I'm at the Naval Postgraduate School where I head up the crew endurance team. We've been studying the sleep and work patterns of sailors in the U.S. Navy for the last 20 plus years. Today I'm going to talk to you about my favorite topic, sleep. We're going to talk about how sleep can be used to improve performance and give you a combat edge. Here's the outline of today's talk. We're going to start out by talking about normal sleep, because for many of you, you may not even know what normal sleep is supposed to look like. Here's a cartoon by one of my favorite artists, Jeff Bacon, talking about the challenges of sleep in Navy ships. When we think about normal sleep, what we know is that many things are happening while we're sleeping. We know it's an active process. There are times when you're sleeping that the brain is actually more active than when you're awake. It's one of the strongest, most insistent drives of the body. If you go 12 to 14 days without sleep, your body goes into sepsis and you die. All animals sleep. Even here out in Monterey Bay, we can see the whales migrating. Half their brain sleeps at a time so that they don't drown. So it's a requirement for our survival. So we know that we have to sleep for our survival, for recuperation, and also for restoration. In the past few years, we've actually determined some other things that happen while we're sleeping. And here's a slide that shows you that. In this cross-section of the brain, we see over this 17-second clip, we see rapid pulsing of cerebrospinal fluid through the brain of this person who's sleeping. This rapid pulsing occurs only while we're sleeping, much slower pulsing that occurs while we're awake. But two things happen during this pulsation. One is that our brains are actually cleansed from two proteins, beta amyloid and tau. And why we want to get rid of these is because we see buildup of beta amyloid and tau plaque in the brains of individuals with Alzheimer's and dementia. So very important to get rid of that. I call this your nightly rinse cycle. Let's take a look at your sleep architecture. So over the course of an 8-hour sleep time, what we see is that the body cycles up and down through different sleep stages. What you'll notice is at the first 4 hours of an 8-hour sleep period, we get a lot of what we call the N3, or deep sleep. That's that dark navy blue color. And then the latter half of an 8-hour sleep period is where we get most of our REM sleep, rapid eye movement. So what happens during these sleep stages? We know that in the deep sleep, that's where most of the human growth hormone is produced and released, while in lots of cellular repair, regeneration occurs there. In the latter half of that 8-hour sleep period is where we have a lot of memory consolidation occurring. We also have a lot of dreams that occur. So we have both this interesting, almost paradoxical situation in REM sleep where we have both laying down of new memories, consolidating memories, and we also have something that pruning of real traumatic memories. So I think about the first half of our 8-hour sleep period as being physical healing, the second half of that 8-hour sleep period as being psychological healing. So those stages occur in about 90-minute to 2-hour cycles. When we look at sleep over the lifespan, we know that they change. Anybody who's a parent of a newborn can attest to the fact that that baby does not sleep through the night. So you see this series of awakenings and naps, awakenings and naps for a newborn. By the time they're a year old, I always tell my students, people that I know, don't worry, by the time they're a year old, they'll be sleeping through the night. And we see typically with a 1-year-old a couple of naps later in the day. By the time they're 4 years of age, perhaps just a single nap. And 10 years of age in most Western societies, very little napping occurring, unless you're in one of those siesta societies that does in fact like to take their afternoon siestas. And then we see this very striking finding that happens across all populations. When you look at adolescents, there's a phase delay in their sleep. They're not ready to go to sleep until later, and they're not ready to wake up until much later. So you see this shift in their sleep patterns. What we know is that teens and young adults actually require 8.5 to 9.25 hours of sleep per night to survive. We also see this change that occurs in adults, where in the adult sleep pattern now they want to go to bed a bit earlier, and they only require 8 hours of sleep compared to the 8.5 to 9.25 that we see in the adolescents. We see that better sleep is linked to improvements in our memory, as we mentioned, our alertness, our ability to concentrate go up, we're more productive, and our performance is actually better when we get better sleep. We also see that we have greater endurance, and our ability to tolerate frustration goes up. And we're actually happier and more optimistic. Now let's talk a little bit about sleep deprivation and its consequences. What we know is that most individuals need a minimum of 7 hours of sleep per night for optimal physical performance. However, we need even more for maximum alertness. Despite the military's efforts all these many years, we cannot be trained to need less sleep. Here's an interesting study that was done in Great Britain looking at a longitudinal study of British civil servants. What they were looking at is all sorts of health outcomes, including dementia. And what they found is that individuals who were sleeping 6 hours or less at age 50 and 60 had a 30% increase in risk of dementia compared to those who were getting 7 hours or more. Again, that really important 7-hour number. We also see that young adults are more vulnerable to chronic sleep deficiency than older adults. This you can see all across the 24-hour span with hours of wakefulness, that young adults actually have more lapses in attention than this older population, the 55 to 70-year-old group. We see that more sleep can reduce our risk of daytime injuries. This is a study that was done in Army Special Forces. What they found is that soldiers who were sleeping 4 to 5 hours of sleep per night were more than twice as likely to report a musculoskeletal injury as those who were sleeping 8 hours or longer. So sleep has this protective effect. We also know that sleep loss reduces our testosterone levels. So you can see in this study, this was looking at healthy young males and who their sleep was 5 hours for 1 week. And you can see that after that 5-hour week-long sleep, that they were getting, that their testosterone levels were much lower all across a 24-hour lifespan. And we know how important testosterone level is for, in particular for male health. And we know that sleep is really important for our immunity. In this slide, what we see is a really interesting pattern where we look at people who were exposed to the common cold virus. Of course, nobody wanted to be in this study, have cold virus squirted up their nose, but in fact, in this study that was done, what they see is that the more sleep you get, the less chance you have of catching a cold. So you can see that in the group on the left, they were getting greater than 7 hours of sleep. Their risk was only 17.2%, and then it goes up significantly on the right. Individuals who are getting less than 5 hours of sleep, their chance of catching a cold went up to 45.2%. We call this a dose-response curve, and it's very important for scientists when we look at this. It's very compelling evidence that sleep is actually causing this change. We also know that sleep is important for our vaccinations. So we know that we get a vaccine. These days, we all know about antibody response. We want to have a healthy antibody response when we get vaccinated. And what we see in this study that was done also up at UC San Francisco is that 6 months after people had received a hepatitis B vaccination, those who were sleeping fewer than 6 hours prior to and after the vaccination were at significantly higher risk of being unprotected. And that's comparing again to people who were getting more than 7 hours. So the bumper sticker here is our sleep habits make a big difference in our immune response. Here's a slide, a photo of one of the sailors. We've ridden lots of ships over the past 2 decades. Here's a sailor just catching a nap when she could. What we know is that sleep deprivation reduces our ability to control impulsive behavior. It makes it difficult for us to interpret other people's emotions, and so that, of course, is going to affect our ability to interact with others and maintain good relationships. And as we've talked about, the idea of sleep deprivation makes it hard to pay attention, react to signals, and remember new information. We also know, and this study looked at what happens to sleep loss, how does it affect team performance and prejudice. And in this really compelling study, what they found is that sleep loss leads to increased intergroup bias and prejudicial behaviors. So we're more likely to make stereotypical judgments when we're at our circadian low points or when we're sleep deprived. The higher the sleep debt, the more we rely on cognitive shortcuts such as stereotyping. Why? Because that effort and motivation that we need to process complex information drops off when we're tired. So again, the bumper sticker here, fatigue sets up conditions for implicit bias to emerge. And I've listed a book here that you might want to refer to by Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman called Thinking Fast and Slow, which talks about a lot of our cognitive biases. There's negative consequences of sleep deprivation showing up in increased risk of migraines, increased risk of motor vehicle accidents. We're actually more prone to obesity and excess BMI due to 2 increases in 2 hormones. We have an increased appetite that's caused by ghrelin. We actually crave carbohydrates, and we don't have enough leptin. Leptin is that wonderful hormone that tells us we're full. And we also see increased risk of psychiatric conditions, including depression, suicidal ideation, and substance abuse. Okay, I've been talking about circadian rhythms a bit, so now we're going to talk specifically about what circadian rhythms are. So when I look at this 24-hour clock, what I can see here is I am looking specifically a number of areas have circadian patterns. I'd call your attention here to melatonin. And you can see here that melatonin secretion starts just before your typical bedtime, and it drops off before you typically awaken. So that's what happens in adults. We see other things that have circadian patterns here on this slide, but we're focusing right now on melatonin, which is really the sleep hormone that helps us fall asleep and stay asleep. Here's this very striking difference that we see in the circadian patterns of adolescents and young adults. Their melatonin doesn't start until much later, but it doesn't drop off till much later as well. So this is what accounts for that phase delay that we see in our teens. They're not just trying to drive us crazy, but in fact, they need more sleep, but the timing of that sleep is different. And I would just point out that many of our junior enlisted and even some of our junior officers can fall into this young adult category, because this can extend into the early 20s. We also know that there are times of the day that we prefer to be awake or asleep. We call this our circadian chronotype. You can actually Google the Lark and Owl test and take it for yourself, but you probably know, are you a morning lark? Do you wake up early in the morning and all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed? Or maybe not, maybe you're a night owl. And here we see in these 2 pictures kind of this idea of these 2 types, these chronotypes. Or maybe you're neither a lark nor an owl, you may be a regular robin. So all of these bird categories can characterize what our typical work patterns we would prefer to be in. We also see that over the course of a 24-hour period, we see two dips that occur in our circadian alertness. And what we see here is just after noon, sometime in the early afternoon, we get a dip that naturally occurs. It has nothing to do with the food that you ate or anything else. It is a natural occurring dip in our alertness. And then we see you get kind of a second wind. And then in the wee hours of the morning, for someone who's sleeping nights, working days, wee hours of the morning, very, very hard to stay alert. We also see time of day differences in lots of our physiological patterns. This slide looks at time of day of leg strength. And on the left, we see leg strength in newtons. And what we see is this pretty striking differences in our leg strength over the course of a 24-hour period. What you see is we're at our weakest about 6 in the morning, and the peak strength occurs about 1700. Peak to trough differences of 21%. Of course, anybody who's trying to compete, professional athletes, anyone who's competing or just trying to do their best, can use this kind of information to actually help them do better. We see that there are certain things that really disrupt our circadian rhythm. Two of those are listed here. Shift work, which we define as anytime you're having to work evenings or nights. If you're on irregular or rotating shifts, all of those things will disrupt your circadian rhythm. And jet lag, so traveling across time zones. Both of these are prevalent in the military. So when I look at what a circadian aligned system looks like, I can see that all my body clocks for all my organ systems are aligned. They're aligned to this master clock in the brain. And so they're all nicely synchronized and working together. But when I experience jet lag or shift lag, what we see is that all these body clocks are all out of kilter. They're no longer synchronized. So when I look at this, I know that it's going to take a while for these organ systems to resynchronize. What we know is that it takes about a day for each hour for your body systems to adjust. Here in the lab, we're working on some different procedures that can help people adjust more rapidly using light, bright light, specialized lux levels that we can help people adjust more quickly. But it's going to take a while for people to adjust to a new schedule. All right, a quick question for you. Have any of you ever nodded off while you were driving? And I'm willing to guess that many of you raised your hands and said yes. So here's a video of a cab driver driving down the highway. You can see he's struggling, trying to stay awake. He hits the guardrail and then crosses across to the median, flips over, lands in the back seat of his cab. What we know is he survived the accident, but two bad things he was doing. The first, he was driving while he was sleepy and he was not wearing a seatbelt. Two no-nos. So if you find yourself falling asleep while you're driving, my recommendation is pull over to the side of the road as soon as you can, get some caffeine, take a 20-minute nap. All of these things will help you stay awake, take care of your passengers and fellow motorists on the roadway. We're thinking about major accidents. What we know is that there are times of the day where we are more prone to this. This graph looks at the relative risk of motor vehicle collisions. And what you can see is it starts at midnight. And what you can see here in this slide is that we get this spike in accidents in the wee hours of the morning. And then it drops off about 7, 8 in the morning. And then we get another spike in the early afternoon. So very interesting. It's the mirror image of what we saw of the circadian alertness pattern. So what I've done is I've plotted some mishaps that occur over on this 24-hour clock. And what you see here is, here's when the Exxon Valdez oil spill occurred at 15 minutes after midnight. Here's where Bhopal, India gas leak occurred at 1 in the morning. Chernobyl, at 1:23 in the morning. Here's the USS Fitzgerald collision and another U.S. Marine Corps F-18 KC-130 midair at 1:30 in the morning. Here's 3 Mile Island at 4 in the morning. And here's the USS McCain collision at 5:24. Does this mean that everything bad happens in the middle of the night? No. Accidents can happen any time of the day or night, but I've plotted these so that you can see we are really much more vulnerable when we're at our circadian low points. Here's a classic study I'd like to show you. This was done by my colleagues out at Walter Reed Army Institute of Research. And in this study, they recruited people to come into the sleep lab and they collected baseline data on their reaction times for the first 3 nights when they were given 8 hours time in bed. Then they randomly assigned them to one of 4 treatment groups. One group, the Lucky Devils, got 9 hours time in bed. Then there were the 7-hour group, 5 and 3-hour group. And then they put them in the sleep lab and watched their performance. Compared to their performance over baseline, what you can see is this very interesting, again, a dose-response pattern. The less sleep they were given, the worse their performance, the slower their performance. And you can see in the 3-hour group, it took them almost twice as long to respond as in their normal or in their baseline pattern. And then the scientists who designed the study gave them 3 days of recovery sleep where they were getting 8 hours time in bed. And what you see happening here is that they had not recovered. The groups that had been sleep deprived, none of them had recovered. And here's the really insidious thing about sleep deprivation. When the scientists asked these people on the last day of recovery, hey, are you back at baseline? They thought they were. They didn't realize that, in fact, the sleep deprivation that they had experienced was still affecting their performance. We put that into a model called the safety FAST model, sleep and fatigue task effectiveness model, and came up with an algorithm. The R-squared for the model is 0.94. Really, really highly significant model. Really tells us a lot about someone's performance. If I know your 72-hour sleep history, I can predict your reaction times. But here's the really important thing to think about. The sleep-deprived brain is unable to judge its level of impairment. Just like the drunk at the bar, when you dangle the keys in front of their face and say, hey, are you good to drive? Yeah, I'm good to drive. No, you're not good to drive. You're inebriated. You do not need to be driving the car. In the same way, the sleep-deprived brain doesn't know if it's reacting well or not. We took the safety model, put it into a tool that is in wide use by the Department of Defense, by the FAA, by all major U.S. air carriers use this FAST tool. And if you have a .mil address, you can have your very own copy of FAST that you can play with. Let me just walk you through a 7-day period with FAST. So here's this 24-hour period that's repeated multiple times across this schedule. Here's the early morning. You can see an early morning dip in performance where I'm falling out of that green zone where I want to be in. And then here's these afternoon dips in performance. This is with normal sleep of 8 hours. But if I reduce the sleep period to only 2 hours, I get a drop in performance. I'm no longer up in the green zone. I'm now in that amber cautionary zone. This predictable drop in performance, we can actually use it to determine what's my performance level at work or during some critical evolution. And over here on the far right, I can also look at a blood alcohol equivalent scale to show how many hours I've been awake, what my performance will be, and how that equates to blood alcohol equivalents. Okay, now we're going to talk about shift work because in the military, many of us are required to work on shifts. So think for yourself, have you ever been a shift worker? That is, worked outside the 8 to 5 routine. and how many years have you done shift work? So when we look at shift work in civilian organizations, what we see is higher rates of workplace accidents for afternoon and night shifts. And if you work longer than 8 hours, it increases the risk of accidents. It's actually 2 times greater for a 12-hour shift than an 8-hour shift. We also see health complications for civilian shift workers. We see gastrointestinal problems, we see cardiovascular problems, metabolic complications, including diabetes. We see obstetric complications for shift workers, and we see increased rates of cancer, breast and colon cancer for females, and prostate cancer for males. There were 2 influential studies that looked at shift work in retirees. These studies were done by Timothy Monk and his colleagues, and they decided they would do this telephone survey of 1,000 retirees to ask them about their sleep patterns, because retirement, that's where we can sleep as much as we want. But what they found is that people who reported being shift workers formerly, when they worked, they had elevated PSCI scores, and that's the score that looks at our sleep quality. So they said, well, how is this possible? And this is years after they've retired, and they're still having sleep issues. So they brought them into the sleep lab. They said, let's see if we can confirm this. And in fact, they confirmed what they had initially come up with, and they realized that people who had been shift workers have poorer sleep compared to people who had never been shift workers. So they coined the term circadian scarring to mean that pattern that occurs when people do years of shift work. And I think probably more discouraging is that we see that the more years of shift work people do, the worse their sleep patterns. So pretty discouraging. But let me tell you, there's some encouragement here for you. So this is a study that I co-authored. We were looking at a sailor who'd been working 5 and dime schedules for many years. So here he appeared at the sleep clinic. He was a 29-year-old. You can see some of the information about him. But he'd been doing 5 and dime schedules for multiple years. So when we look at a 5 and dime schedule, the graph on the left shows you 9 days of what a 5 and dime schedule looks like. The gold bands show when they would be standing watch, and the dark blue shows when they would have sleep opportunities. So you see that over the course of this 9-day period, they never sleep at the same time for any 3 days in a row. They're always rotating their sleep. So huge problem with their circadian rhythm. So when you look at what happened with this sailor, the sailor comes into the sleep lab, and guess what? You can see the same kind of staggered pattern where they were sleeping at a different time each day. It was as if his brain was stuck in this 5 and dime non-circadian pattern. But we were able to re-entrain the sleep of the sailor using bright light and 1 milligram of melatonin at night, bright light in the morning, and very quickly his sleep became stabilized. So if you have sleep issues, if you're having sleep patterns that are circadian scarring, some of these kinds of things that you think may be going on, please get help, because these things can be addressed, and the sooner you get help, the better. We're going to talk a little bit about sleep in the military culture. Again, another cartoon by Jeff Bacon. When I first started teaching here at NPS in 2000, I didn't have a sleep lab, but you invited me out to your ships and your watch floors to look at your sleep, and lo and behold, I had a ready-made sleep deprivation chamber. As a matter of fact, the things that you were doing to yourselves, in particular for the Navy, submarines and surface ships, were things that I would never have been able to get permission from our Human Use Committee to do to healthy individuals. But you were doing that already. So I had a ready-made sleep lab. And this shows you some of the data that we've been collecting over the last 20 years. The red line over here is 8 hours of sleep, so you can see how much sleep sailors are getting on board ships. The blue lines are the sleep watches that we were having people wear, and we were recording their sleep, and you can see how much sleep is occurring. The gold bands are self-reported sleep. But when we look at this, what we see is that with a single exception, no one is getting more than 8 hours of sleep. That single exception was on LCS-2 during rough water trials. I was riding the ship, and a lot of people were in their racks because they were seasick. So that's why they were getting a lot of sleep, but not a lot of work going on. So the NPS crew endurance team has conducted research all over the world. These red pins indicate some of our data collections, more recent data collections. We're going to be collecting data up on a polar transit. So lots of data. We looked at sailors all over the globe. One study in particular I want to point out to you compared sailors that were working a 5 and dime schedule that I've already talked to you about, compared what happens if I put them on a circadian-based watch bill. And we looked at their fatigue, their mood, and their PVT scores. And here's a few of my sailors there that are wearing my sleep watches that actually allow me to collect data on their sleep and the light exposure that they're getting, and it gets their PVT reaction times. So here's some of our sailors. When we look at these individuals and look at their reaction time, what we see is when they were on a circadian-based watch bill, and the one we used for this study was a 3-9 schedule, 3 hours on watch followed by 9 hours off watch. It was a 4-section watch bill. And we compared that to these same sailors when they were working a 5 and dime. Of course, that's a 3-section watch bill, but at the time, the nuclear reactor department on board the Nimitz, USS Nimitz, had enough qualified watch standers, so we put them on this 3-9 to see what happened. And lo and behold, their reaction times were significantly faster, about 30% faster, and probably more importantly is their error rates. What we see is they had fewer errors, 40 to 50% fewer, when we compared their performance on the 3-9 and the 5 and dime. And their mood actually did not get worse. So what you see is on the 5 and dime, we see that their mood got significantly worse, and on the 3-9 it actually improved a little bit. So when we did that study, we were able to brief the results to a 4-star admiral at the time. The head of naval reactors was Admiral John Richardson. We briefed him on this, and he asked us, will you help me come up with guiding principles so that we can help sailors get better sleep? Of course, anytime a 4-star asks you to do something, the correct response is, yes, sir, yes, ma'am. So here were the guiding principles that we developed for Admiral Richardson, who then went on to become the Chief of Naval Operations. So here they are. You want to have your focus on alert and engaged watchstanders, because just because you have somebody who's standing watch, if they're not alert, they're not really standing a good watch. You want to learn and understand the effects of good sleep, and that's what you all are doing today. Also, you want to use that 24-hour circadian rhythm to set the foundation for your entire unit and build a stable daily schedule, including the watch bill, that maximizes rest opportunities at the same time each day. But we know that one size doesn't fit all, so sometimes you have to consider trade-offs, and that's something that NPS does a lot of by supporting your analysis of your schedules. Early in my time here at NPS, we did some studies out at Great Lakes at the Recruit Training Command, and in this series of studies, we first went out and we briefed the command there. We said, we believe that right now you're giving your recruits only 6 hours of sleep. Maximum is 6 hours of sleep per night. In this young adult population, teen young adult population, we knew that they required significantly more. So we said, these are the things we think you can achieve by giving them more sleep. So from 2002 to 2004, we did a series of studies where we watched their sleep as it went from 6 hours of sleep per night to 8 hours of sleep per night. And what we see is in their test scores, highly significant differences in their standardized test scores. When we look at these individuals who are getting 6 hours of sleep versus 8 hours of sleep in 2003, highly significant differences. And this is after adjusting for ASVAB scores, because we know 9/11 occurred in 2001, so maybe we're just recruiting smarter sailors. So after adjusting for those ASVAB scores, we still get highly significant differences. People will often ask me, well, what exactly is a circadian-based watch bill? And I put this slide in to try to show you in a very simple definition, what does a circadian watch bill look like? In a circadian-based watch bill, you will be sleeping about the same time each day. In the top graph, you see an actogram of a sailor who goes to bed about the same time and wakes up about the same time each day. That's a circadian-based watch bill. And you contrast that with the graph below that shows you this sailor getting sleep at all times of the day and night, sometimes going extended periods without any sleep. So that's a non-circadian watch bill. We know that sleep is really important for leaders, not just in their own sleep patterns, but for them to lead well. And what we see in this study reported in the Harvard Business Review, they were looking at sleep of 40 managers and 120 people reporting directly to them. They looked at what happened to them their first 3 months together. They measured their sleep, and they also recorded the quality of boss-employee relationships. What they found is that, no surprise, sleep-deprived leaders were more impatient, they were irritable and antagonistic, but they were completely unaware of it. So here's the bumper sticker. When the boss doesn't feel rested, the whole unit pays a price. We're going to talk a few slides now about tips for healthy sleep. If you want to sleep like a pro, you need to make a sleep plan. You need to set a bedtime early enough to get 7 hours of sleep, and sticking to that routine and keeping a consistent sleep schedule. I recommend that you keep a notepad by your bedside so you can jot things down. If you wake up in the middle of the night, you're afraid you're going to forget the next day, you can make a note of it for the next day. Your preparation for sleep starts during the daytime by limiting your caffeine and energy drinks to the first half of the workday. We recommend avoiding eating too close to bedtime, especially heavy or greasy foods, and avoiding alcohol before sleep. Ideal sleep conditions should be completely dark, quiet, or sometimes people say if it's too quiet I can't sleep, so a fan or white noise, cool ambient temperatures, and eliminating sources of odors. We've seen that on ships in particular with shared berthing space that can actually disrupt people's sleep. So be respectful of your bunkmates. We know that light exposure is really important for sleep, and we see that blue light from our digital devices can disrupt our melatonin, delay our sleep onset. And we see the same thing in sunlight for people who are working night shift. If they see the sunrise, it can be very hard for them to go back and get to sleep right off the bat. So light management is really important. Here's a little advice about alcohol. We know that alcohol can make you feel sleepy and drift off to sleep, but we see that your sleep architecture that we showed you at the beginning of this talk gets disrupted, and you need to get up and go to the bathroom often. So again, this whole idea of alcohol is not really your friend when you're trying to get good sleep. This slide talks about naps. So naps are a great way to supplement your sleep if you can't get 8 hours, and often that's the case. So you can take naps before a sustained ops or surge mission, and that will reduce that drop in performance that you get. So you can prepare, basically preloading or sleep banking your sleep. We recommend a nap of 30 minutes so that you don't go into the deep stages of sleep, or 2 hours so that you go through one complete sleep cycle. Here are prime windows for napping. When we look at that 24-hour clock, we can see that prime window for napping is that early afternoon, and of course in the middle of the night, great time to be sleeping. We see that there's been research that's looked at, we call it a nappuccino or a calf nap, where you have a small cup of coffee right before you take a nap. If you're going to try to awaken, we know that caffeine takes about 30 minutes to come to full effect. So about the time you're ending that 30-minute nap, that caffeine is kicked in and you're ready to wake up. We have an NPS website that can help you if you're trying to get more information on crew endurance. We also have a crew endurance handbook that you can download from the website. It has a lot of information about what we call the good, the bad, and the ugly, good circadian watch bills, bad things that we want you to avoid, and then some things that are ugly but circadian, and the port and starboard kinds of schedules fall into that category. So here's my challenge to you today. What will you change in the way you lead your own team and in your own sleep as a result of this talk? So that concludes today's talk. I hope that you will take better care of your sleep and the sleep of your crew.